Hello, friends. Welcome to part 2 of hopefully many of me reading you a bedtime story. Is that the direction I'm going with? Is this like a bedtime vibe? I'm not sure. Let me know. But I'm having a blast doing this. It's an excuse to read a book and to practice my editing. Before I start any further, I would like to just remind everybody that English is my second language. So please be nice to me. There's words I can't say because I never said them before. So this is also an excuse for me to practice my English reading and public speaking. And if you like this, and then my French voice is much nicer, I'm thinking about doing my next book in French. So if we can get through this one, which I might not, it's so much simpler if I just read this myself, but let me know if you vibe with this, because I will keep going. Today we are at, also, it's a great excuse to distract from the world, so get comfortable while I figure out where we're at. We are the prologue last time, and now we are at section 1. So I don't know if the chapters are called sections in this book. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's sections. So it's called Dirty Mecca, 1989 to 1990. Ooh, interesting. The one of the big reasons why I wanted to read this book was really because from last video, the reviews, it seemed like it was really a love letter to his come up years and life in New York City in the 90s, which I find so fascinating. And also, I love Moby, so please don't take this video down. This is like a love letter, and if anything, I feel like you're my cool uncle who I never get to see, and this is me like doing a school project, even though I'm not in school, but I'm allowed to pretend, so it's not weird. This is me just reading a book. Not sure if it's legal or not, but everyone loves a rebel. Section 1, 100 square feet. A little. Are you ready? Are you comfortable? Are you snuggled in? Let's do this. The roosters finally shut up at 7 a.m. There were 4 recurring sounds in the abandoned factory where I lived, a mile south of Strandford train station. 1. Gunshots. The crack dealers would regularly shoot at each other, usually starting after the sun went down. 2. Amplified gospel. Every weekend, there were big rival tents set up in the nearby storefront Dominican and Jamaican churches, trying to get the crack dealers to leave the neighborhood. Number 3. Public Enemy, our EPMD, our Bob Bass, our DJ Easy Rock. Every 15 minutes, a car would drive by playing Fight the Power, or It Takes Two, to a toaster oven rattling level. 4. Roosters. Everyone on the street opposite of the abandoned factory kept roosters in their backyards. The roosters would start roostering around 4:30 a.m. exactly when I was trying to go to bed. I kept an old radio next to my bed and turned it to a non-station when I needed to sleep. The static just barely masked the dawn staccato styling of the testosterone-fueled roosters across the street. Sorry, that was... C'était pénible. That kind of sucks. It's not a very pleasant living situation. I've definitely been there. I feel like this universe brought me this book when I was at the grocery store and it was right at the aisle. I'm like, oh shit, I didn't know this book existed. Because I feel like I'm going to see myself a lot in this, which is good. That's part of the reading experience, being able to relate to your life. All right, next page. I had moved into this abandoned factory 2 years ago, and I loved it. In the 19th century, it had been a huge lock factory, comprising of 20 or 30 giant brick buildings. Now, in 1989, it was a dark and hulking mass in a neighborhood famous for having the highest murder rates in New England. A decade earlier, a real estate developer had bought the whole complex, put up a fence, and hired some security guards to look after it. A few of those guards made extra money by charging squatters and other random people $50 a month to illicitly live or work in the abandoned factory. I was making about $5,000 a year, so $50 a month squatter's rent was within my budget. My space was small and sandwiched between a gay porn production studio and an artist's loft. But it was all mine. 100 square feet of abandoned factory where I could live and work as long as a security guard took their $50 and looked the other way. My walls were built out of the discrepant plywood that my friend Paul and I found in a dumpster. Paul and I had gone to Darien High School together, where we had bonded over loving science fiction and being the only poor kids in Darien, Connecticut. The walls of my 100 square foot loft looked like a brown wooden quilt, and it was in the summer heat the plywood would smell like the dumpster where we found it. My space had a solid, beautiful door that had been rescued from an abandoned house near Route 7 in Norwalk, and the entire floor was covered with thick, beautiful ivory carpeting that I had taken from the garage of a friend's parents. I hadn't gotten permission to take the rug, but I told myself that it was fine because I could give it back if they ever noticed it. I had never cleaned the rug, but it remained improbably pristine. I had a small brown school desk for my Casio keyboard, my Alesis drum machine and sequencers, my Tascam 4-track mixer, and a terrible Yamaha sampler. I couldn't afford speakers, so I listened to everything through a pair of Radio Shack headphones. I cooked my meals in a toaster oven and on a single burner electric hot plate, and I was happy. I love the crumbling bricks. I love the old factory weight of a century of different factory smells. And I love my huge window that faced south, letting in pale light in the winter and blistering full-throated sunlight in the summer. There were approximately 100 square feet of space in the factory complex. It was so huge, I had no idea how many other people lived there. And although I took up only 100 of those square feet myself, I had access to the whole place. I would ride my friend Jamie's motorcycle up and down the empty factory floors, sometimes playing motorcycle bowling, setting up bottles at one end of the factory floor and trying to knock them down with the motorcycle wheels. When I was bored, I would go exploring. I'd find old propane canisters, barrels of industrial chemicals, giant rusty wrenches, spool of steel cables, and the occasional dead pigeon. When friends and family visited me, they were dismayed. My 5-year-old cousin Ben visited me with my Aunt Anne, stood in the doorway of my small space and announced, "This is terrible." I smelled like a homeless person because although I had a quasi-residence, I was full functionally homeless. I didn't have running water or a bathroom or heat, but I had free electricity, which is the one utility I needed to make music. When I needed to pee, I would use an empty water bottle. With no bathroom, I was bathing only once a week. If I visited my mom's house or my girlfriend's dorm, I could use the shower there. Yeah, solutions. I usually stank, but I'd stopped offending myself. I loved everything about my life in the abandoned factory. Well, not everything. I did not love that I had been working on music for years and was still in a small city 40 miles away from New York. I didn't love that no record label had expressed any interest in my electronic music, or that I had never actually played it for anyone except my girlfriend. But aside from my longing to live and make music in Lower Manhattan, the abandoned factory was perfect. Most days, I would wake up in the loft bed around noon, make oatmeal on my hot plate, read the Bible, and work on music. When I wanted a break, I would ride my skateboard up and down the long, empty hallways of the factory, or walk to the local Dominican bodega where I could buy oats and raisins. Today, however, I was headed to New York City, my dirty Mecca. There were a few ways to get to New York. Sometimes I would ride my old mop to Darien, where my mom lived, and borrowed her aging Chevy Chevette. I would drive into the city following the route that I learned from my grandfather when I was 8 years old. He taught me how to get into the city without paying tolls, though it meant driving through the most crime and drug-ridden parts of New York. Sometimes I could find someone who was already driving into the city and get a ride with them. But usually I took my Metro North, a commuter train that connected New York to its suburbs. I spent my childhood fleeing Connecticut for Manhattan via Metro North. My punk rock friends and I would all put on our best punk rock t-shirts and go into the city hoping that real punk rockers would notice us and approve of our Black Flag and Bad Brains shirts. Heading into the Grand Central Terminal in the morning, we'd sit next to sleepy white businessmen. Coming home at night, we'd sit next to the same white businessmen who were now drunk and exhausted. If the police were around when I left the factory, I would climb out via one of the huge glass and steel windows to avoid the scrutiny of the cops. Today, there was only a truck rumbling down the road, so I left from the back door. Stepping outside, clenching my body against the cold, it wasn't a dry cold, but a wet cold that made my socks heavy and stabbed my bones. It had snowed 3 days earlier, covering the ground with a pristine and angelic blanket, quickly ruined by freezing rain. I walked under the gray sky across the pitted and broken tarmac of the parking lot, picking my way through the maze of puddles when I got to the chain-link fence. I let myself out through a hole in the corner and headed for the Stamford train station. Walking into the train station, I passed some storefront churches with a hand-painted sign, a grocery store with bulletproof plexiglass, and a special on Schlitz malt liquor, the Cavalier Pool Hall, and some shuttered and abandoned buildings. Within a minute, my hands and feet were already cold. The scattering locals on the streets looked homeless or scared, and they were nonplussed by the badly dressed white kid walking through their neighborhood. The next train to Grand Central didn't leave for half an hour, so I stopped at the pool hall to play a game by myself. The room was dark, within a few dim lights over the 5 pool tables. Even low wattage lighting couldn't conceal that the felt on the table was scarred and burned from decades of cigarettes and spilled drinks. Aside from me there was one person playing a midday game of pool, and the guy in the back who rented you your cue and a rack of balls for $1.50. I often stopped at the pool hall on my way to the train station. Even though I was a mediocre pool player, I consoled myself with the knowledge that if I were any good at pool, I'd run the table quickly and not be able to play as long. So, with so many things, there was utility in avoiding excellence. The pool hall was always filled with cigarette smoke. That wasn't surprising. I worked in bars where everyone smoked and went to restaurants where everyone smoked. Even though I was a non-smoker and there were only 2 other human beings inside the pool hall, it seemed normal for the room to be filled with smoke. I never spoke with other pool players, or the guy handing me the cues and racks. I hoped that someday they would say, "How are ya?" or even give me a subtle nod, but they just tolerated me. Apart from me, the only white people around here were the suburban kids buying crack and heroin. The irony that it was even though I was sober, I was seen as part of the problem. Another drug-addicted white kid running in the neighborhood. Eventually, the locals realized that I lived there, and while they didn't give me any friendly nods, at least it stopped the hostile stares. I finished my game, hoping that either of the other guys in the pool hall looked at me. They would think that I was a better player than I actually was. On the rare occasion when I sunk a trick or satisfactory loud shot, I would glance up to see if anyone had noticed. They never did. As a scrawny white kid, I was an anomaly, but not so interesting that I actually warranted much of anybody's attention. I shrugged on my thrift shop winter coat, which smelled like cigarette smoke and wet sheep, and trudged the last few hundred yards to the train station. I passed one of the storefront churches. They were having a service inside. I could hear tambourines, an electric organ, and a choir singing. Sometimes on Sundays, when the churches were full in swing, I would stop by and sit in the back. When the weather was nice and all the churches had their doors open, I would walk down the streets and it would sound like a beautiful Tower of Babels, with all the churches filling the streets with perfect competing versions of the gospel. Puerto Rican churches were next to the Abyssinian churches, right alongside the evangelical and Pentecostal congregations, and whatever other brand of churches could justify renting a storefront and buying some plastic folding chairs. If I stood listening in the doorway too long, I made the congregation uncomfortable, so I usually stood just to the side of the doorway listening to the Casio organs and raised voices. When I got on the train, I immediately headed to the bathroom. In high school, I learned that you could avoid paying the $5 fare if you hid there. I was heading to New York City to drop off a DJ mix cassette at a brand new nightclub. I'd heard about it from my girlfriend Jeanette. We'd been dating for a few months. Jeanette had grown up riding horses in Greenwich, Connecticut, but now lived in the Colombian dorms. She was a sophomore at the university and had an internship at Interview magazine. She looked like Katharine Hepburn circa the Philadelphia story, but her heroes were the writers of Paper and the Village Voice, and she was obsessed with nightclubs and galleries. A writer at Interview had told Jeanette that a new nightclub called Mars was hiring and that if I hurried down, I could drop off a mixtape. So, in the torn pocket of my wet jacket, I had 60-minute cassette of my best DJ mixes, hip-hop on one side, house music on the other. I had worked on this tape for days, mixing grooves on the 4-track cassette recorded and then overdubbing them with a cappella tracks from obscure hip-hop and disco 12-inch records. I wanted to look less homeless than I usually did, so under my second-hand jacket, I was wearing my coolest nightclub outfit: black turtleneck, black jeans, black dress shoes, all from Goodwill and the Salvation Army. I sat in the bathroom of the Metro North train for 45 minutes, inhaling the smell of pee and disinfectant and studying the artwork my friend Jamie had drawn on the cover of my tape. Was it cool enough? Was it cool at all? Jamie had designed the logo for me, all elaborate graffiti swoops and jagged edges. He was an inspiring graffiti artist, but was also a white kid from Norwalk, Connecticut, who studied accounting at UConn. Would anyone else know that? Maybe the logo was cool. I had no idea. I had started sending similar mixtapes to radio promoters in California. I'd seen an ad in a DJ magazine. Wanted, your mixtapes for national radio syndication. I'd called the number listed and spoken to the Shirley man in Oakland, with the sound of a crying baby in the background. He told me that he could get my mixes played on the radio, so I'd been sending him 30-minute hip-hop mixes. I hadn't received any money for the mixes, nor did he ever tell me if my mixes were being played, but I kept sending the mixes in the hope that someone somewhere was listening. The train pulled into Grand Central. I got out of the bathroom and rushed past the commuters, through the vast space of the station and onto the subway system. 15 minutes later, after jumping into 2 subway turnstiles, I was running down 14th Street along the bloody sidewalk of the meatpacking district. I made it to Mars, breathless with hope and excitement. Mars was a nightclub in an abandoned warehouse, huge and dirty and hulking. A club impresario named Rudolph had rented it with the intention of turning it into the biggest and best nightclub on the planet. Its facade looked out over the West Side Highway, some sex and bondage clubs, and the slate-gray Hudson River. There were no restaurant or bars in the meatpacking district, but there was a line in front of the club, hundreds of cool New Yorkers hoping to get a job. I stood in line in my black nightclub clothes, hoping that other people wouldn't notice that I was, in fact, a small and badly dressed white kid who lived in an abandoned factory in Connecticut. After an hour of waiting, I got to the front of the line, and in the foyer of the nightclub there, 3 people sitting behind a big folding table, handing out paperwork. One of them asked, "What application do you want? Busboy, bartender, security?" Do you have a DJ application?" I asked. There was a pause, and then they laughed. "No, we don't have a DJ applications," a discreetly calm woman behind the table told me. She was a beautiful African-American woman wearing a long black coat, over a weathered New York Dolls t-shirt. Yucky's already hired the DJs, she explained. Oh, well, can I just leave my tape? I asked. It's house music on one side and hip hop on the other. Maybe you could give it to the person who hires the DJs. She looked at me with pity, but she accepted my tape. Then she directed her attention to the person in line behind me. I stood there, frozen. Okay, thanks, I said, to no response. Okay, bye. I hurried out and walked out to the corner to use the payphone so I could call Jeanette. I was broken. I walked to the next payphone a block away, and it was broken too. It was drizzling. I was cold. The sky was low and dark, and I had just humiliated myself in front of a cool and beautiful woman at what was going to be the best nightclub on the planet. I had the temerity to dream that I could be a DJ at Mars. I was a fool. And now I was standing with my feet in a slurry of rain and animal blood, staring at a broken payphone. I had $15, so I walked to the health food store on 13th Street and 8th Avenue. When I had left the factory and rushed into the city, I had been full of hope I would finally be a New York City DJ. And now I was walking through the rain, hunched forward against the cold wind to buy groceries from hippies. I purchased my soy milk and sprouted bread, jumped the turnstile on the F train, noted that F seemed like an appropriate grade for this trip to NYC, transferred to the Grand Central Shuttle at 42nd Street, and splurged on a ticket back to Stamford so I wouldn't have to sit in the bathroom. On the train, I ate my bread and drank my soy milk, sometimes looking through the scratched windows at the South Bronx, sometimes reading a copy of the New York Rocker that someone had left on the seat. The bands in the New York Rocker had record deals and played shows. They did interviews. They released records. People took their pictures. People listened to their music. It was everything I dreamt about. I wanted to play music for an actual audience. I wanted to DJ in dark, crowded rooms in New York City. But, in fact, I was a borderline homeless 23-year-old electronic musician whose only paying work was DJing Mondays at a tiny bar in Port Chester, New York, and every Saturday night at an all-ages club in a church in Greenwich. When I got off the train at Stamford, the rain had picked up, so I rushed back to the factory. I walked down a long hallway to my tiny studio and called Jeanette. It still amazed me that I had a phone. When I first moved into the factory, I had called the phone company to see if I could get a phone. The very next day, they sent someone, and 5 minutes later, after they arrived, I had a working phone. He didn't ask me if I was living in the factory legally. He just laid down some wire and installed a phone jack. As he left, I almost asked him what was his name so I could name my firstborn child after him. How was it? Jeanette asked excitedly. Did they hire you? Well, there was a lot of people in line looking for work, but I left a tape with one of the women in charge, I told her. Great, how are you feeling? I feel good, I lied. We chatted for a few minutes, made plans to go to church together on Sunday, and hung up. I'd done everything I could to get hired at Mars. I'd rushed to New York City in the rain. I left behind a tape decorated with an accounting student's idea of cool graffiti. Now it was in God's hands. Well, not the tape. I assumed the tape was in the garbage or in someone's answering machine. But the situation was in God's hands. So I did what I always did. I turned on my studio and worked on my music. I made quiet ambient house music until midnight. Then I took off my headphones and turned off my equipment. I made some oatmeal and read a battered Star Trek paperback while listening to a Debussy cassette. Sitting by the window with the rain beating against my enormous factory windows and the space heater on full blast, I was happy. I was unwashed and smelly. I lived in an abandoned factory in a crack neighborhood, and it had been an intensely disappointing day. But I was calm and happy. At 4 a.m., I went to sleep in my tiny loft bed, listening to the rain. In the morning, the rain had stopped, but it was still cold and overcast. I made more oatmeal in my hot plate and then went into my food stash for a few almonds and an orange. Almonds and oranges were luxuries, But the day before had been rough, and I wanted a treat. I was almost out of water, so after breakfast, I walked down the street to the bodega to buy 2 large plastic bottles of water. Walking back to the factory, I noticed the huge amounts of dirt in the empty parking lot. Once the beginning of a construction project, they were now just big piles of mud. When I got back to my studio, I saw that I had a message on my answering machine, and I hit play. The cassette rewound, and I heard the best message anyone had ever heard in the history of phone messages. Hi, this is Yuki Watanabe, calling from Nightclub Mars. I'm calling for DJ Moby. I listened to your tape. Call me to see about DJing at Mars. I froze in place. I played the tape again. And then again. Someone named Yuki with a thick Japanese accent had listened to my mixtape, and this same person was interested in having me DJ at Mars. I listened to the message once again to make sure it was real. And then again. And for good measure, again. I picked up the phone, terrified. I had to call Yuki and somehow convince him to give me a DJ job at Mars. Please. That was all I could say to him or to God. Please. I held the phone on my sweaty hands and dialed the number. Doot, 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 doot. Hello, this is Yuki Watanabe. A rumbling voice said, oh, yes, man. Hello, this is Yuki Watanabe. A rumbling voice said slowly. Hello, this is Yuki Watanabe. Hi, this is DJ Moby, I said, talking too quickly. You called me about DJing at... Yes, I listened to your tape. It's very interesting. DJ Friday night? Yes, I can DJ Friday night. Okay, you play in the basement, 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. It pays $100. Thank you, I'll see you then. Okay, DJ Moby. I hung up and thought about Walker Percy. There's a scene in his novel, The Moviegoer, when the protagonist is in a museum after an accident. He has a moment of clarity, and suddenly he sees a tiny dust motes floating in the sunlight. My own life had just changed, on a larger scale than I could ever imagine, and I can see dust motes floating in the winter light that streamed through my oversized windows. I sat on my carpet, still clutching the phone, my neurons firing like the whirling atoms in a PBS science video. Had this really happened? Was I hallucinating? Was ancient factory fumes corrupting my brain? I listened to the answering machine message again. It was real. I had just been hired to DJ in the basement of the coolest nightclub in the planet. No longer saw the abandoned factory or the phone or the sky framed in my window. In my mind's eye, I saw the basement of Mars. I imagined a room painted black with low ceilings and a perfect sound system, a dark filled with demonically cool people. I would stand there at the elevated DJ booth playing hip-hop and house music. I called Janet. She was out, but her answering machine picked up. Janet, you'll never believe it. You'll never believe what just happened, I blurted out. Yuki from Mars called. I'm going to be DJing at Mars on Friday night. I can't believe it. I can't believe it. Call me. I can't believe it. I hung up. I needed to thank God, so I got on my knees on my stolen carpet. Thank you, God, I whispered. Thank you, that's all. Thank you. And that is the end of section 1. Section 2, we will be reading Vegan Cookies. So if you like this, please let me know. I had a fun time reading. And yeah, stay safe. And if you want to buy the book, it's called Moby Porcelain, a memoir by Moby, the artist. And if you want to check out his music, I've created an amazing playlist of all my favorite of his songs that I'll probably be adding on to the more I explore his music even more. But he's an icon, and that was pretty cool. So definitely loves God. That's what I got out of this. So he lived in a factory, praying to God, and he finally got to DJ in a basement. But he hasn't DJed yet, so we don't know how that's gonna go. So if you're curious, so am I. So stick around. I'll probably be posting the next video in the next couple of days. So until then, stay safe. I love you. You're special. You're seen. Everything you feel is valid, and everything does get better. You just gotta be more confident in yourself and know what you want, and you go get it. Because I believe in you and myself. You gotta believe in yourself too. Okay, bye. You guys are still here. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed that video, and remember to like and subscribe.